Hawaii, the island of Aloha, a slice of paradise just outside the United States. Snow isn't falling, but it is December. Yes, these islands near the equator are the perfect getaway from the hustle and bustle of city life. A home away from home, where the sun shines and the flowers bloom. A picture of paradise. But turbulence is brewing on the horizon. For on this early December morning, there will be trouble in paradise. A surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, a United States base with over 100 naval vessels, including 8 fully armed battleships. So, how did the Japanese do it? How did this one attack cause the US to enter World War II and change the outcome of it forever? And how is such a catastrophe often forgotten? There is a heavy focus on the European theater of World War II. The Nazis and Holocaust consume many of the lessons taught in history classes. However, the fight in the Pacific theater and the atrocities that occurred there amounted to more deaths than in Europe alone. Japan joined Nazi Germany on September 27, 1940, becoming a part of the Tripartite Pact, otherwise known as the Axis powers. Their goal, expand their empire in the Pacific.
They were an isolated nation for hundreds of years. That all changed in 1853 when the United States sends a group of warships to Tokyo Harbor, of what became known as gunboat diplomacy, and they began to adapt Western technologies and quickly industrialize. They don't want to become a colony themselves. They need more farmland, more natural resources.
The Americans were the people in charge of a lot of the oil production and oil distribution in that area. Japan, who had already been fighting this lengthy war with China.
This really upsets the U.S. because we're trying to come out of the Great Depression, and China was a trade partner of ours.
Needed oil for their machines and to continue with their efforts.
Now the U.S., in efforts to halt this expansion and then efforts to stop their advancements into Indochina, the United States had put restrictions on the Empire of Japan.
They set an embargo up against Japan, not allowing for steel or iron or, most importantly, oil to go into the country. They also freeze all their assets. 80% of the oil that Japan was receiving came from the United States, so this made things tough for them as far as fighting China, because you can't fight a war without oil. They basically end up with two choices. Either they accept the U.S. terms and get out of French Indochina and China itself, or they go and find the oil on their own. And they decide that they're going to do that, and they make plans to invade the Dutch East Indies and the British-owned Malaysian islands, which are rich in oil.
Nearly the top among the most productive oil fields in the world.
And they planned an attack after Tojo became prime minister in October of 1941. So they chose the American air base and naval base where the Pacific Fleet was kept in the Pacific Ocean. Now, the mastermind of the attack was Yamamoto. Now, Yamamoto planned the attack in hopes to cripple the U.S. naval fleet, and he did.
The whole point was to really just buy them time. Yamamoto knew that destroying Pearl Harbor and taking out all of the military base was just going to enrage the American people, and the industrial complex that was America was going to build it back up.
And they were hoping that if they took out the Pacific Fleet for the United States, that the United States would then look to make peace with Japan, and they could continue their expansion throughout Asia.
They knew they just had to slow us down, delay us, get us involved in the conflict long enough for them to continue to build up their navy, take those islands in the Pacific, and then to strengthen their control and their reach in the region.
They caught us being very foolish. We were arrogant. We put all our assets in one place. We lined our ships up, and it made it a much easier target than it would have been otherwise.
There were some who came to the conclusion that it would be Pearl Harbor. The U.S. had expected Japan to make some sort of attack, some sort of act of aggression. But it was not the popular opinion. It wasn't the common thought at that time until the early morning hours, a Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, as President Roosevelt later said,
a date which will live in infamy.
6:45 a.m., America takes its first shots of World War II at a Japanese submarine. 35 minutes earlier, a wave of nearly 200 Japanese planes took off from one of Japan's aircraft carriers positioned 275 miles north of the islands.
At 7 a.m., radar picked up images which they believed to be American air fleet.
About 40 minutes later, at 7:40 a.m., Pearl Harbor goes up in flames.
350 planes began attacking Pearl Harbor.
We were not in a defensive posture at all. We just weren't ready, and then people are scrambling, and things are blowing up, people are dying, the ships are sinking.
One of those ships is the USS Arizona. Along with it, a dozen 14-inch guns and 22 5-inch guns, and over 1,000 crew members. It was the largest ship in the Navy's fleet. Not even an hour later, the second wave of Japanese planes attacks.
A lot of people drowned in Pearl. There were people trapped in the ships when they flipped upside down that actually were trapped, and then when they tried to cut the bottom of the hull out to get the people out, the air that was keeping an air pocket with them went away, and they filled with water and the people drowned.
The attack was damaging, causing 2,400 Americans to be killed and 1,200 to be injured. We had 18 warships that were sunk. 8 out of the 9 battleships at Pearl Harbor were so severely damaged that they were unable to be used immediately. Japan lost 29 planes and 64 men.
Dense black smoke billowed to the sky as the massive control tower began to keel over. The Arizona's...
Now, the response, of course, was a declaration of war. President Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war on Japan, and then ultimately the U.S. goes to war with Japan, Italy, as well as Germany, making up the Axis powers.
Simultaneously, Germany declares war on us, and then the decision was made that we are going to fight the war in Europe first, the war in the Pacific second.
The U.S. was launched now into World War II.
You know, as America got behind the war effort, we turned our military into like a superpower.
The Japanese were fanatical. They didn't believe in surrender. And if someone was to surrender, they saw that as a weakness. And generally, if you did surrender, they would kill you. And that led to a lot of what we call banzai charges, where hundreds of men would come out into exposed position and charge U.S. forces, generally leading to their deaths.
Whereas Europe was mostly, you know, we did a lot of bombing, we had tanks, infantry. We put Marines on beaches on these islands all over the Pacific to fight. And, you know, it took a long time to turn the tide. And by the end of the war, technology that came out of it was the nuclear weapon, the atomic bomb. Japan didn't want to surrender, so we dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and they saw the devastation. This was a city we did not bomb before that, because we wanted to see what kind of effect this weapon would have. They wouldn't surrender, so we dropped one on Nagasaki, and after that bomb was dropped, they agreed to surrender.
On board the USS Missouri, a highly decorated battleship during World War II, Japanese representatives signed the official surrender of Japan. September 2nd, 1945, after about 60 million deaths worldwide, World War II ended.
Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
So when World War II is all said and done, the world is left with 2 superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. Japan was no longer the power that they had become in the 30s and into the 40s.
So we often hear about Germany and how Germany got carved up by the different powers. Japan didn't really have that issue because the United States government, we were pretty much the major force that took Japan.
So U.S. policy is going to be the promotion of democracy in post-World War II years, in competition, of course, with the Soviet Union and their attempts to spread communism around the world. We felt the need that it was time to really build up the Japanese economy. We needed allies in Asia, especially at the start of the Cold War.
Demilitarized the government, got rid of the emperor, and tried to get them to be more peaceful.
The U.S. worked to build up relations with that country, and now today, 2023, the U.S. and Japan are allies. Matter of fact, Japan is one of our most significant allies in the region.
The Japanese people have a much bigger respect towards peace. They've seen the horrors of war. They saw what continuous war did. And still to this day, we have bases in Japan.
Today, Japan is a prosperous and peaceful nation with a unique culture that combines old traditions with the newest technologies. But should Pearl Harbor be taught more?
Well, I think the main reason why people don't know about Pearl Harbor is it's not as celebrated as it could be. And when I say celebrated, I mean more so recognized as an event of historical significance. And Pearl Harbor, I think, is an event so important because it's the first time the U.S. had been attacked in that manner. And it's something that's going to create such an important decision for us as a country and lead us to change really the rest of the world.
I don't want to say more, but I think it's every bit of the equivalent of what happened in Europe.
I also feel that the events of Pearl Harbor were earth-shattering in many different ways. And it would almost be foolish to have one thing taught and not the other. And so much of it has interesting stories that people should know about.
We spend a lot of time here talking about it, but there have been some great movies that have been put out in the Pacific. And I think that, more folks in the United States have heritage that goes back to Europe as opposed to in Asia. So maybe that has something to figure into why it's not as well known.
The war in Europe and the Pacific, they should be equal. 9/11 is important, that should be taught too. But we repeat these things.
Hawaii is very far away. So there's that issue versus New York. New York is right there in the center of the most populated part of our country. There is a memorial there, and they actually just updated it about a decade ago and made it look like a college campus. It's beautiful, but it's a lot of recency bias. You got to think about the idea that today, this happened in 1941, so we're looking at 82 years ago. So most of the people who were alive back then when that happened aren't alive anymore.
9/11 is more recent in our memories. Pearl Harbor was in 1941, but for folks that were around then, December 7th was, as Roosevelt said, a date that lives in infamy. So it certainly wasn't forgotten. And of course, there are the memorials that are there, the Arizona, where over 2,000 soldiers are at rest at this point.
So I think kind of the understanding and study of Pearl Harbor too is important to kind of understand the sacrifice of those soldiers, the sailors, as well as the airmen who were at Pearl Harbor during those attacks, and kind of to understand their sacrifice, and the Americans who decided to join the armed services and fight in World War II as well. So it's important to recognize their sacrifice.
Today, the Memorial of Pearl Harbor stands in solitude in beautiful and colorful Hawaii, a silent reminder of the tragedy that changed the world forever.